What if the most repeated story about a hit TV show isn't actually about what happened, but about what people wanted to believe? Think about that for a second. Because for years now, one name has been dragged into conversations that blur gossip, speculation, and outright invention. A name that started on a cable television drama. A name that later exploded into global relevance. A name people talk about as if they were there, when most of them weren't. Meghan Markle. In one show. Suits. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to admit out loud. Once a story is repeated enough times, it stops sounding like a rumor. It starts sounding like history. Short sentence. Heavy implication. But what if the foundation of that history is thinner than anyone wants to check? In the next hour, we're going to dismantle a narrative piece by piece. Not by shouting louder. Not by repeating the same recycled talking points, but by slowing everything down, by asking questions most people skip, by separating what was actually said from what was twisted into something far more explosive. And it all starts with one claim people swear came from the mouth of the man who created the show. Aaron Korsh. Did he really reveal shocking behind-the-scenes behavior? Or did the internet do what it always does? Take a fragment, strip it of context, and turn it into fuel? Here's why this story matters now. Suits didn't just resurface as nostalgic comfort TV. It exploded again. New audiences, younger viewers, social media clips, algorithmic rediscovery. And with that rediscovery came something else. Old rumors revived, sharpened, and delivered to millions who never saw the original interviews, never read the full quotes, and never questioned the source. Ask yourself this. How many times have you seen a headline so shocking you didn't even open the article? How many times did you assume someone must have said it because everyone else repeated it? This is how myths are born in plain sight. And the timing couldn't be more perfect or more dangerous. Because when fame evolves, the story around a person evolves with it. A supporting actress becomes a breakout character. A breakout character becomes a celebrity. A celebrity becomes a cultural lightning rod. And suddenly, everything that came before gets rewritten through a new lens. Every smile becomes suspicious. Every casting decision becomes strategic. Every success becomes explained. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Why is it that when a woman rises quickly in Hollywood, the conversation so often shifts away from talent and toward implication? Why are ambition and opportunity framed as scandal? Why do certain rumors cling harder when the subject refuses to play along? These are not random questions. They are the spine of this entire story. Because once you start pulling on this thread, you realize something unsettling. Most people talking about the truth of Suits era Meghan Markle are not referencing interviews, production realities, or industry norms. They're referencing echoes. Echoes of anonymous posts. Echoes of clipped quotes. Echoes of stories that sound believable because they fit a stereotype people are already comfortable with. And that stereotype? It existed long before Suits ever aired. Let's slow this down. Television sets are not party scenes. They are rigid, scheduled, contractual, governed by HR, unions, legal departments, and network oversight. Cast members are monitored. Relationships, real or rumored, carry consequences. NDAs aren't optional. Silence is often mandatory. Yet somehow, the internet prefers a much juicier version. A version where a single actress holds invisible power over an entire production. A version where professionalism collapses behind closed doors. A version where success needs an explanation that feels scandalous enough to justify it. And once that version exists, it doesn't need proof. It just needs repetition. Here's the psychological trap most audiences fall into. If a rumor aligns with what you already suspect, you stop asking where it came from. If it flatters your assumptions, you don't check the receipt. If it confirms a bias, it feels true, even when it isn't verified. That's not a personal flaw. That's human behavior. But it becomes dangerous when it's amplified by platforms that reward outrage, speed, and certainty, especially when the person at the center doesn't, or can't, respond. And that's where silence becomes a weapon. Silence is read as guilt. Silence is read as confirmation. Silence is filled in by speculation. But something crucial gets lost in that noise. Context. Context like timelines. Context like who said what and when. Context like how quotes are edited for maximum impact. Which brings us back to the man whose name is often used as a stamp of credibility in these conversations. Aaron Korsh. Because somewhere along the line, an idea took hold that the creator of Suits had exposed something scandalous, that he had lifted the curtain, that he had finally said what everyone was whispering. But here's the problem. When you trace those claims backward, actually trace them, you don't find a smoking gun. You find fragments. A sentence pulled from a longer answer. A phrase divorced from tone. A paraphrase repeated until it becomes a quote. And once it's labeled as a reveal, no one asks if it really was one. This is where the story shifts from celebrity gossip to something much bigger. Because this isn't just about Meghan Markle. It's about how narratives are constructed in real time. How reputations are reshaped after the fact. How public memory is edited not by evidence, but by engagement metrics. It's about why certain stories go viral while others disappear. And it's about why the most dangerous sentence in modern media isn't a lie. Its sources say. Over the next chapters, we're going to do something most viral videos don't. We're going to pause. We're going to rewind. We're going to interrogate the assumptions baked into this story. We'll look at how Hollywood sets actually function. We'll examine how rumors gain legitimacy. We'll break down what was said versus what was inferred. And we'll ask the question most people avoid. What if the untold truth isn't scandal at all, but the machinery that manufactures it? Because once you see that machinery in motion, you can't unsee it. And the moment you realize how easily perception replaces proof, everything you thought you knew about this story starts to feel unstable. But we're just getting started. Because the rise of Suits and the rise of Meghan Markle within it didn't happen in a vacuum. And the moment that show took off, the whispers began. What if the story people tell about a show's success says more about the audience than the actors themselves? Because before the whispers, before the rumors, before the internet decided it knew what really happened, there was just a struggling cable drama trying not to get canceled. Let's rewind. In 2011, legal dramas were everywhere, and most of them blended together. Courtrooms, sharp suits, confident monologues. Viewers had seen it all before. When Suits premiered, expectations were modest. This wasn't supposed to be a cultural reset. It was a calculated risk on a cable network hoping to catch lightning without a massive budget. And that context matters more than people realize. Because when a show starts small, every success feels accidental. And when success feels accidental, people rush to explain it. Here's the truth most retrospectives skip. Suits wasn't an overnight phenomenon. It built slowly, episode by episode, season by season. Characters grew on audiences. Dialogue clips circulated. Chemistry became a talking point. And one character, in particular, started getting more attention than the network initially anticipated. Rachel Zane, played by a then largely unknown actress named Meghan Markle. Now pause here, because this is where memory starts lying to people. It's easy, in hindsight, to assume she walked on a set already destined for spotlight. That casting doors flew open. That the industry was waiting. That's not how it works. Meghan Markle wasn't a star when Suits began. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't a protected asset. She was a working actress in a brutally competitive industry, auditioning like everyone else, landing a role that could just as easily disappear after a season. Ask yourself this. How many shows have you watched where a supporting character quietly becomes essential? It happens all the time. Writers adapt. Audiences respond. Storylines shift. That's not scandal. That's television. But here's where the contradiction begins. When male actors experience that rise, it's called momentum. When female actors experience it, people start asking why. Why her? Why so much screen time? Why that character? Those questions didn't explode publicly at first. They simmered, quietly. On forums, in comments, among viewers who felt something changing but didn't yet know what to call it. And that unease is important. Because unease looks for a story. Behind the scenes, Suits operated like most cable dramas. Long hours, tight schedules, writers adjusting arcs mid-season, directors rotating, cast members locked into contracts that limited freedom more than they granted it. This wasn't a playground. It was a workplace. But workplaces don't fit the myth people prefer. The myth is more exciting. The myth says, something extra must have been happening. Now let's talk about casting dynamics. Because this is where perception really starts to drift. Casting directors don't gamble entire productions on interpersonal drama. Networks don't risk advertisers on unchecked chaos. HR departments don't vanish because a show is popular. And yet, when viewers look back, they imagine Suits as some kind of unchecked environment where anything could happen. Why? Because success makes people suspicious. And success without an obvious explanation makes them even more uncomfortable. Rachel Zane wasn't written as a background character. She was designed to matter. Smart, ambitious, complicated. A character whose appeal wasn't limited to romantic tension, but professional aspiration. And that aspiration is what triggered something subtle but powerful. Projection. Audiences started projecting narratives onto the actress herself. They blurred character traits with personal motives. They assumed that because Rachel wanted more within the show, Meghan must have wanted more behind the scenes. See the leap? That leap happens fast. Faster than people admit. One moment, you're watching a character grow. The next, you're assuming the actor engineered it. And once that assumption forms, everything is reinterpreted through it. A line delivery becomes a signal. A camera angle becomes favoritism. A storyline becomes evidence. Let me ask you something. Have you ever rewatched an old show after learning something about an actor, and suddenly everything feels different? Same scenes, same scripts, different lens. That's exactly what happened here. As Suits gained traction, coverage followed. Interviews, red carpets, media training. Suddenly, Meghan Markle wasn't just another cast member. She was being asked questions, being photographed, being recognized. And with recognition comes backlash. Not always immediately, but inevitably, especially for women. Especially for women who don't fit neatly into an existing box. Here's where timing matters. Social media was accelerating. Gossip culture was decentralizing. Anyone could publish speculation. Anyone could frame it as industry talk. And those early whispers? They didn't need confirmation. They just needed circulation. What no one talks about is how quiet the actual set remained. No public feuds. No HR scandals. No lawsuits. No on-record accusations. That absence didn't calm speculation. It fed it. Because silence is unsettling to people who want drama. And as Suits continued, the imbalance between what viewers imagined and what could be proven widened. Then came the interviews. The creator of the show, Aaron Korsh, was asked repeatedly about casting, chemistry, and character development. Normal questions. Industry standard conversations. But here's the dangerous part. When people already expect a revelation, they hear one. Even when it isn't there. A comment about professionalism becomes a coded message. A compliment becomes a clue. A general statement becomes a confession. This is how context gets stripped. A long answer becomes a quote. A quote becomes a headline. A headline becomes a belief. And once belief sets in, contradiction is ignored. What's ironic, almost painfully so, is that the early success of Suits depended on something deeply uncontroversial. Consistency. The show worked because it delivered reliably. Characters showed up. Stories progressed. The cast functioned as a unit. Networks don't reward instability with longevity. Yet, years later, people speak as if the show thrived despite chaos. Why rewrite it that way? Because chaos is entertaining. Stability is boring. And when Meghan Markle later stepped into a much larger spotlight, the hunger to retrofit drama into her past became overwhelming. Viewers didn't just rewatch Suits. They reinterpreted it. Scenes were clipped, music added, captions framed. Suddenly, moments that once felt ordinary were presented as loaded. But let's ground this. If something truly explosive had been happening on set, would it have stayed hidden for a decade? In an industry where leaks are currency? In a production involving dozens of crew members, writers, assistants, executives? That question alone should give anyone pause. Yet it rarely does. Because the story people prefer is simpler. It turns professional success into scandal. It turns collaboration into manipulation. It turns ambition into accusation. And once that narrative takes root, the rise of Suits becomes less about storytelling and more about suspicion. This is the pivot point. The moment when a breakout role stops being a career milestone and starts being treated like a mystery that needs solving. And from here on out, the whispers don't fade. They evolve. They sharpen. They wait. Because what came next? Meghan's exit from the show and her sudden transformation into a global figure gave those rumors new oxygen. And once oxygen hits embers, everything ignites. But the whispers that began during the rise of suits were only the beginning, because the internet hadn't yet decided what it wanted this story to be. That decision was still coming, and when it arrived, it would change the narrative forever. What if the most dangerous part of a rumor isn't the lie itself, but how believable it feels? Because by the time people start asking whether something is true, the story has already won. Let's talk about how that happens. Not in theory, not in vague terms, but in the exact ecosystem that surrounds Hollywood, and why certain stories don't just appear, they're engineered. Here's the first uncomfortable fact. Most rumors don't start as lies. They start as guesses. A look interpreted the wrong way. A schedule misunderstood. A casting choice explained without evidence. Then the guess meets an audience that already suspects something. And that's all it needs. Hollywood thrives on proximity. Everyone is one step removed. A friend of a friend. An assistant's cousin. Someone who heard things. That distance creates plausible deniability and irresistible mystery at the same time. Ask yourself this. When you hear someone close to production said, do you ever ask who that someone actually is? Most people don't, because anonymity sounds like protection, like truth hiding from retaliation. But anonymity also protects fabrication. And once gossip moved online, it evolved. In the old days, rumors stayed local. Studio lots, closed rooms, trade whispers. If it didn't get picked up by a major outlet, it died. Now a single post can circle the globe in minutes. Blogs, forums, reaction channels, anonymous submissions, all feeding off each other. One person speculates, another paraphrases, a third adds emotion, a fourth adds certainty. And suddenly, speculation becomes narrative. This is where the Suits era whispers entered a different phase. They weren't loud at first. They were subtle, framed as industry talk. They didn't accuse outright. They implied. An implication is powerful because it invites the audience to complete the story themselves. Here's a trick gossip culture uses. Instead of saying something directly, it asks a question. Isn't it strange how fast her character grew? Don't you find it interesting how often she was featured? Doesn't it make you wonder what was happening off camera? Those questions don't demand proof. They plant suspicion. And suspicion spreads faster than fact, especially when it plays into a familiar stereotype. Ambitious woman. Competitive industry. Male-dominated power structure. People have seen this story before, even when they haven't. So when Meghan Markle became more visible within the show, the rumor machine didn't invent a new script. It reused an old one. That's the part no one likes to admit. Hollywood gossip isn't creative. It's repetitive. The same accusations get recycled with different names. The same language appears decade after decade. The same conclusions are drawn without new evidence. What changes is the amplification. Social platforms reward engagement. Engagement loves outrage. Outrage loves certainty. So stories get sharpened. Edges get sanded off. Nuance disappears. Here's where contradiction enters. People claim they don't trust tabloids, yet they repeat tabloid logic. People say they hate gossip, yet they consume hours of it framed as analysis. People say they want truth, yet they reward whatever confirms their suspicion first. This is how a rumor matures. Phase 1, curiosity. Phase 2, repetition. Phase 3, assumption. Phase 4, memory. By Phase 4, people stop remembering where they heard it. They just remember that they did. And now the rumor doesn't need defending. It feels obvious. But let's talk about the specific environment of a television set, because this is where fantasy overtakes reality. TV sets are not improvisational spaces. They are controlled systems. Schedules are locked. Interactions are logged. Professional conduct is enforced. Romantic relationships, real or rumored, are liabilities. Networks manage them aggressively. Legal departments get involved. Publicists step in. Yet the internet imagines a version of TV production where none of this exists. Why? Because chaos is more entertaining than procedure. So when someone online suggests that everyone knew something, they're relying on an image that doesn't align with how the industry actually functions. But the audience doesn't see the contracts. They don't see the NDAs. They don't see the compliance meetings. They don't see the union regulations. They see a story, and stories don't need paperwork. Here's another uncomfortable layer. Rumors grow stronger when the subject doesn't fit cleanly into an existing narrative. Meghan Markle wasn't just another actress. She was biracial, American, not raised inside the same social networks as many of her peers. And that's when you realize something unsettling. The rumor didn't survive because it was true. It survived because it was useful. Useful for content. Useful for outrage. Useful for explaining a rise people didn't want to attribute to talent, timing, or work. And once you see that pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Different name. Same script. But the Suits rumor machine was only warming up. Because there was one thing left that would supercharge everything. A quote. Or rather, a quote people swear they heard. In the next chapter, we're going to slow down one of the most referenced claims in this entire saga and do something radical. We're going to look at what was actually said. And when you see how context was stripped away, line by line, you may realize the story everyone repeats never really existed at all. What if the most quoted reveal in this entire story was never actually a reveal at all? Because by now, you've probably heard some version of it. Someone says the creator of the show admitted something. Someone insists it was on record. Someone claims it explains everything. And almost no one can tell you where the quote actually came from. That alone should make you pause. Let's slow this down, carefully, because this chapter is where certainty starts to crack. The name that keeps getting invoked as the final authority is Aaron Korsh, creator, showrunner. The man whose words are treated like a confession whenever Suits-era rumors resurface. Here's the assumption people make without realizing it. If the creator said it, it must be true. If it was in an interview, it must be explicit. If everyone repeats it, it must be settled. But assumptions don't survive contact with transcripts. Let's talk about how interviews actually work. When a showrunner sits down with a journalist, the conversation isn't a deposition. It's loose. It's conversational. It jumps between topics. Questions are often broad. Answers are often contextual. What you read later is not the conversation. It's a selection. And selection is where everything changes. Because once an interview leaves the room, it enters a different economy. A headline economy. A click economy. A paraphrase economy. Here's the dangerous part. A paraphrase can sound stronger than the original statement. An edited quote can suggest intention that never existed. A missing sentence can reverse meaning entirely. And once that altered version circulates, the original becomes irrelevant. Let me ask you something directly. When was the last time you tracked a viral quote back to its full interview? Be honest. Most people don't. They trust the repetition. They trust the confidence of the person repeating it. That's exactly what happened here. At various points over the years, Korsh was asked about casting chemistry, professionalism, and on-set dynamics. Standard questions. Nothing unusual. But somewhere along the line, fragments of those answers were lifted out and framed as something much more scandalous. Words like chemistry, words like connection, words like relationships. Normal language in a television context. Dangerous language when stripped of context. Because the internet doesn't hear nuance. It hears implication. And implication is easy to weaponize. Here's the contradiction people rarely acknowledge. If a showrunner truly wanted to expose misconduct, they wouldn't do it casually in an entertainment interview years later. They wouldn't do it vaguely. They wouldn't do it without names, details, or consequences. That's not how real revelations happen. Real revelations come with fallout. Legal fallout. Professional fallout. Public backlash. None of that followed these supposed quotes. No cast member responded. No network statement followed. No clarification was issued because, crucially, there was nothing to clarify. The problem wasn't what Korsh said. The problem was what people decided he meant. Let's talk about clickbait mechanics, because this is where distortion becomes systematic. A journalist or blogger hears an interview. They pull a line that sounds intriguing on its own. Not false, just incomplete. They add a headline that leans suggestive. They frame the article around interpretation, not declaration. They rely on readers to connect dots that were never drawn. Then comes phase 2. Other outlets don't re-listen to the interview. They cite the first article. According to reports, as previously revealed, Korsh hinted that. And now we're no longer dealing with primary sources. We're dealing with echoes. Echoes don't need accuracy. They just need volume. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Many of the people most confident about what Korsh revealed have never read the full interviews. They've never heard the tone. They've never seen the follow-up questions. They're reacting to reactions. This is how misinformation hardens without anyone intentionally lying. Each person believes they're passing along something established, but establishment was never earned. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Why do these alleged quotes always seem to point in one direction? Why do they always reinforce the same narrative? Because ambiguity is a blank canvas. People project what they already believe onto it. If you already think success must be explained by something scandalous, you'll hear scandal in neutral language. If you already distrust a public figure, you'll interpret vagueness as confirmation. This is confirmation bias in real time, and it's devastatingly effective. Here's another question you need to sit with. If the creator of Suits had truly witnessed or condoned anything inappropriate, why would the show have continued uninterrupted? Why would the cast remain intact? Why would the network promote it aggressively? Why would no legal mechanism ever activate? People underestimate how risk-averse networks are. One substantiated issue can shut down production overnight. But Suits ran smoothly, consistently, profitably. That doesn't align with the myth people prefer. So the myth adapts. It becomes softer, less specific, harder to disprove. It was an open secret. Everyone knew. He couldn't say it directly. These phrases are shields. They protect the rumor from scrutiny. Because how do you disprove something that's defined by absence? You can't. And that's the genius and danger of how this story was constructed. Let's be very clear here. No on-record statement from Aaron Korsh explicitly accuses anyone of misconduct. No verified quote details inappropriate behavior. No credible source confirms the most extreme claims. What exists are interpretations. And interpretations feel solid when repeated enough times, especially when they're emotionally satisfying. But there's another layer people overlook. Korsh himself has consistently emphasized professionalism when speaking about his cast. Respect, work ethic, collaboration. Those statements rarely go viral because they don't shock. They don't explain success in a way that flatters suspicion, so they get ignored. Instead, the internet clings to the one thing it can bend: ambiguity. And ambiguity becomes accusation when paired with imagination. This is the moment in the story where many viewers realize something unsettling. They weren't reacting to evidence. They were reacting to framing. And framing is powerful. A sentence that reads one way in context can read very differently when isolated. Tone disappears in text. Pauses disappear. Clarifications vanish. And what's left is a silhouette people can project onto. That silhouette became the foundation for years of speculation. Not because it was proven, but because it was convenient. Now here's the twist that really matters. Once a public figure becomes controversial later in life, everything they did earlier gets reinterpreted as foreshadowing. Past interviews become clues. Old quotes become confessions. Silence becomes strategy. This is hindsight bias masquerading as investigation. And it's one of the most powerful narrative traps of the modern media cycle. So when people say, even the creator admitted it, what they're really saying is, I've seen this repeated so often that I no longer question it. And that should scare you. Because if repetition can replace verification here, where else is it happening? But we're not done. Because quotes don't distort themselves. They're distorted by the environment that consumes them. And to understand why these interpretations stuck so aggressively, we need to look at something else entirely. The myths people carry about life on a TV set. Because once you see how reality clashes with fantasy, the entire rumor structure starts to wobble. And in the next chapter, we're going inside that world. The real one, not the version people imagine. And what you're about to learn will make you question whether the story people repeat could even exist the way they claim it did. What if the version of a TV set most people imagine doesn't actually exist? Because somewhere between glossy interviews and behind-the-scenes fantasies, audiences built a picture of television production that feels dramatic, chaotic, and emotionally charged. A place where power is fluid, rules are loose, and personal dynamics secretly drive everything. That image is compelling. It's also mostly wrong. And this is where the entire rumor narrative begins to collapse under its own weight. Let's start with the uncomfortable truth that rarely makes it into gossip culture. A television set is not a playground. It's a factory. A creative factory, yes, but still a factory. Time is money. Delays are penalties. Mistakes ripple outward. Every minute costs thousands. sometimes tens of thousands, sometimes more. That reality shapes behavior far more than personal drama ever could. Here's what people don't see. Call sheets. Daily schedules broken down to the minute. Union regulations governing hours, breaks, and conduct. HR oversight that doesn't disappear just because cameras are rolling. When people talk about everyone on set, they imagine a small group of actors casually interacting all day. In reality, hundreds of people rotate through a production. Crews shift. Directors change. Writers aren't even physically present most days. Producers monitor remotely. Network executives check in constantly. Privacy is rare. Isolation is rarer. Now ask yourself this. In an environment that's structured, how likely is it that sustained misconduct could occur without leaving a trace? Not a lawsuit. Not a leaked email. Not a corroborated account. Not a single on-record complaint. That question alone destabilizes the rumor. But the myth persists because people misunderstand how television storytelling works. Let's talk about character development, because this is where fantasy overtakes logistics. When a character grows in prominence, it's not usually because of one person pulling strings. It's because writers respond to audience feedback, chemistry, and narrative efficiency. Television is reactive. If viewers respond to a dynamic, writers explore it. If a storyline tests well, it expands. If a character resonates, they appear more. This isn't favoritism. It's survival. Shows that don't adapt die. So when Rachel Zane became more central to Suits, it wasn't a mystery. It was a response. But audiences don't see the meetings. They don't see the notes. They don't see the analytics. They just see the result. And when people don't understand process, they invent motive. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. People claim the set was full of tension, yet former cast and crew have consistently described it as professional. People claim there were hidden dynamics, yet no one has ever described them concretely. People claim everyone knew, yet no one can say who everyone actually was. That vagueness isn't accidental. It's necessary. Specifics can be checked. Vagueness can't. Now let's dismantle another fantasy. The idea that actors control storylines. Actors do not write scripts. They do not approve edits. They do not dictate camera coverage. They do not override network notes. Even lead actors have limited influence, and Suits, at its core, was not a star-driven vehicle. It was an ensemble show anchored by concept and dialogue. Power lived above the set, not on it. So when rumors suggest that interpersonal dynamics dictated creative direction, they're misunderstanding where authority actually sits. Authority sits with showrunners, producers, and networks. And authority leaves paperwork. If something unusual had been happening, it would have generated a trail. But the trail doesn't exist. Instead, what exists is projection. Projection fueled by how people imagine Hollywood operates. Here's another myth worth dismantling. The idea that long hours automatically lead to chaos. Long hours actually do the opposite. They exhaust people. They narrow focus. They make efficiency sacred. Most cast members arrive, perform, and leave. They're thinking about tomorrow's lines, next week's scenes, contract renewals, career longevity. Drama is a liability, not an indulgence. But let's address the emotional core of why people resist this reality. Because accepting that Suits functioned like a normal, professional workplace removes the scandal people want. It forces them to confront a less exciting explanation. That a woman succeeded because she fit the role, delivered the performance, and benefited from timing. And for some reason, that explanation feels insufficient. So the myth fills the gap. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why does professionalism feel unbelievable when applied to certain people? Why does competence trigger suspicion instead of respect? Those questions matter because they reveal more about audience psychology than any alleged behind-the-scenes story ever could. Now let's talk about chemistry, because this word has been misused more than almost any other. When showrunners talk about chemistry, they mean something technical. How actors read off each other. How scenes flow. How dialogue lands. It does not mean intimacy. It does not mean personal relationships. It does not mean off-camera behavior. But the internet collapses those meanings into one. Why? Because chemistry sounds intimate. And intimacy sells. So when someone hears a creator praise chemistry, they don't hear craft. They hear implication. And that implication gets recycled until it feels like confirmation. Here's another detail that rarely enters these conversations. Television sets are among the most litigated workplaces in entertainment. Studios are hyper-aware of risk. Insurance policies are strict. Behavioral complaints are documented aggressively. Even unsubstantiated allegations trigger internal processes. So again, ask yourself, where is the evidence of those processes here? There isn't any. Which doesn't stop the rumor from thriving, because rumors don't need institutional backing. They just need emotional momentum. And emotional momentum builds when stories align with existing biases. One of those biases is the belief that success must be earned through something other than merit, especially when it comes quickly. Another is the belief that women who navigate power structures must be manipulating them. These biases don't announce themselves. They disguise themselves as skepticism. I'm just asking questions. It doesn't add up. Something feels off. Those phrases feel rational, but they often hide a deeper discomfort. Discomfort with ambiguity. Discomfort with success that can't be easily explained away. And that discomfort looks for relief. Relief comes in the form of rumor. Now consider this. If Suits had been plagued by dysfunction, why would cast members remain for years? Why would they renew contracts? Why would they promote the show enthusiastically? Why would crew members continue working season after season? People leave toxic sets. Word spreads fast in the industry. Yet Suits retain talent. That fact doesn't fit the myth, so it gets ignored. Instead, attention shifts to isolated moments. Facial expressions, pauses in interviews, perceived tension in edited clips. But edited clips are not reality. They're content designed to provoke reaction. And reaction rewards exaggeration. Here's where the gap between myth and reality becomes impossible to ignore. The imagined version of the Suits set requires secrecy, chaos, and complicity from dozens of professionals. The real version requires none of that. The real version requires routine, structure, and predictability. And predictability doesn't generate viral content, so it's discarded. But the consequences of discarding it are serious. Because once you accept a fictionalized version of a workplace, you open the door to accusations that feel plausible but lack foundation. And those accusations don't stay contained. They follow people. They redefine legacies. They rewrite histories. And when the person at the center later becomes controversial for unrelated reasons, the myth hardens. People say, see, it all makes sense now. But sense isn't the same as truth. And stories that make sense emotionally can still be wrong factually. That distinction is where this entire saga unravels. Because the reality of a TV set doesn't support the narrative people repeat. And once that realization sinks in, another question becomes unavoidable. If the environment itself doesn't support the rumor, then why did the rumor stick? The answer isn't on the set. It's in what happened next. Because when Meghan Markle left Suits, the story didn't end. It transformed. And that transformation, how exit narratives get weaponized, is where speculation truly exploded. And once you see how leaving a show can rewrite everything that came before, you'll understand why this story refused to die. What if the real scandal isn't what people accuse, but who they choose to accuse? Because by the time Meghan Markle's rise on Suits became a topic of suspicion, the mechanics of rumor had already locked into place. But something else was quietly steering the conversation, something far older than social media, far older than cable television. A double standard. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start with a simple observation that makes people uncomfortable. Hollywood is full of ambitious people, men and women alike, climbing, networking, positioning themselves for the next opportunity. Yet only one group routinely has their ambition reframed as something else. When men rise quickly, the language is flattering. He's driven. He's strategic. He understands the system. He played the game well. When women rise quickly, the language shifts. She's calculating. She's manipulative. She must have done something behind the scenes. Same outcome, different interpretation. Ask yourself honestly. How many male actors have seen their careers accelerate without anyone demanding a moral explanation? Plenty. How many female actors experienced the same rise without suspicion following them? Very few. This is the context that wrapped itself around Meghan Markle long before she ever left Suits. Because once her visibility increased, the narrative didn't ask what she was doing well. It asked what she must be doing differently. And differently is where insinuation lives. Here's the contradiction people rarely acknowledge. The entertainment industry openly rewards chemistry, likability, and presence. Those are not secrets. Casting directors talk about it constantly. Producers admit it freely. But when a woman benefits from those traits, the benefit itself becomes suspect. Suddenly, chemistry. During the show's original run, Meghan Markle was rarely framed as controversial. She was discussed as part of the ensemble. Interviews were light. Coverage was professional. The suspicion came later. After her profile changed. After her visibility exploded. After public opinion polarized. That timing matters. Because it shows the rumors weren't driving perception. Perception was driving the rumors. And once perception flips, evidence becomes optional. Here's another contradiction people avoid. Many who criticize Meghan Markle claim they oppose misogyny. Yet they repeat narratives that rely entirely on misogynistic tropes. The ambitious woman, the social climber, the manipulator. Those archetypes didn't originate with her. They're recycled, and they stick because they feel familiar. Familiarity is persuasive, especially when paired with incomplete information. Now think about this. If a man had left a successful show and gone on to achieve unprecedented global status, would his early career be dissected for moral explanations? Or would it be celebrated as a trajectory? History answers that question for us. But because Meghan Markle is a woman, and because she later became a lightning rod, her earlier success needed to be reframed as suspect. This is how double standards operate. They don't announce themselves. They masquerade as curiosity. They hide inside, just asking questions. But the questions are rarely neutral. They're pointed. They're repetitive. They're selective. And they almost always aim in the same direction. Now let's talk about betrayal. Because betrayal is the emotional engine behind much of this discourse. Some audiences felt ownership over Suits, over its characters, over its tone. When Meghan left the show, that sense of ownership was disrupted. And disruption breeds resentment. Resentment asks, why did she leave? Resentment answers, because she wanted more. And wanting more becomes the crime. But wanting more is not wrongdoing. It's human. It's also celebrated when the person wanting more fits expectations. Here's the pivot point. Once Meghan Markle stepped into a global spotlight far beyond Suits, the stakes of her story changed. People didn't just want to understand her success. They wanted to judge it. And judgment always reaches backward. That backward reach is what turned ordinary career progression into alleged conspiracy. But notice something critical. None of the accusations ever produce specifics. No timelines. No corroborated accounts. No concrete actions. Just implication layered on implication. Because implication doesn't require proof. It requires plausibility. And plausibility is subjective. Here's the hardest truth in this chapter. The rumors stuck not because they were proven, but because they aligned with what people were ready to believe about a woman who refused to stay small. That's uncomfortable. That's messy. That challenges how we like to see ourselves as fair observers. But it explains everything. It explains why the same claims resurface regardless of contradiction. It explains why debunking rarely works. It explains why people say, I don't know, but something feels off. That feeling isn't intuition. It's conditioning. And once conditioning takes hold, it doesn't fade easily. Now ask yourself this. If the story were reversed, if the gender were reversed, would the rumor have survived this long? Or would it have been dismissed as envy, speculation, or sour grapes? The answer matters, because it reveals the invisible framework shaping the conversation. And that framework didn't disappear when Meghan left Suits. It followed her. It intensified. And it would soon collide with something far more powerful than television fandom. A departure. Because when someone leaves a story before audiences feel ready, they don't just leave a role. They leave a vacuum. And vacuums get filled. In the next chapter, we're going to examine what happens when exit narratives take over, how leaving a show rewrites everything that came before, and why departures are the most dangerous moment in any public figure's story. Because what came next didn't just reshape Meghan Markle's past. It weaponized it. What if the moment someone leaves is the moment the story truly begins? Because departures don't just end chapters. They invite reinterpretation. And once reinterpretation starts, nothing that came before is safe from revision. Think about it. When an actor exits a show early, audiences rarely accept the simplest explanation. They don't want scheduling conflicts. They don't want contract terms. They don't want career timing. They want motive. They want drama. They want a reason that feels proportional to the loss they're experiencing. And that's exactly what happened here. When Meghan Markle exited Suits, it wasn't treated as a professional transition. It was treated as a puzzle, a mystery, a decision that demanded decoding. Why would someone leave a successful show? Why now? Why before the story feels finished? Those questions weren't neutral. They were loaded. Because the show hadn't ended. The audience hadn't said goodbye. And unresolved endings make people restless. Restlessness looks for someone to blame. Here's where exit narratives become dangerous. Once someone leaves, they lose the ability to correct the story in real time. They're no longer present. They're no longer visible in the day-to-day rhythm of production. Their absence becomes symbolic. And symbols are easy to distort. Suddenly, leaving isn't just leaving. It's abandonment. It's ambition. It's betrayal. It's confirmation of everything people already suspected. Ask yourself this. How many times have you heard someone say, "If nothing was wrong, why did they leave?" That sentence sounds logical. It's not. People leave jobs all the time for reasons that have nothing to do with scandal, growth, opportunity, timing. Life changes. But in entertainment, leaving early violates an unspoken expectation. Gratitude. Audiences expect loyalty. They expect endurance. They expect people to stay where they were first accepted. And when someone doesn't, the reaction can be harsh. Especially when the person leaving later achieves something bigger. Because success after departure feels like a rejection of the thing people loved. And rejection hurts. That hurt gets reframed as suspicion. Now here's the key shift that happened with Suits. Once Meghan left the show, the narrative flipped from observation to explanation. Before the exit, people noticed changes. After the exit, people explained them. Screen time became strategy. Visibility became maneuvering. Career progression became proof. This is hindsight bias at work. People looked backward and said, "It was always there," even when it wasn't. Even when those same moments passed unnoticed the first time around. Let's slow this down. At the time of her exit, the explanation given publicly was straightforward. The story moved on. The show continued. The character was written out with minimal disruption. There was no public meltdown, no cast rebellion, no emergency press cycle, which should have ended the speculation. But it didn't. Because a quiet exit doesn't satisfy an audience that feels entitled to drama. So the story evolved. It stopped being about what happened. It became about what must have happened. And must have is where imagination replaces evidence. Here's the contradiction people ignore. If there had been real chaos behind the scenes, the exit would have been louder. Studios don't bury scandals cleanly. They manage them, yes, but not invisibly. Leaks happen. Rumors splinter. Details emerge. None of that occurred here. Instead, the exit became a blank screen people projected onto. And projection is powerful. Because projection allows people to retrofit meaning without accountability. They can say, "I always felt something was off." That feeling becomes proof. Now let's talk about narrative ownership. Audiences often feel they own a show. They invest time, emotion, and identity into it. When someone leaves, that sense of ownership is challenged. And challenged ownership looks for justification. She wasn't committed. She thought she was better than the show. She used it as a stepping stone. Notice how those explanations shift responsibility. The show remains innocent. The audience remains wounded. The individual becomes suspect. That pattern repeats constantly in entertainment. And once the individual becomes suspect, their entire history is reevaluated. Early ambition becomes early manipulation. Confidence becomes calculation. Success becomes something that needs explaining away. This is how exit narratives work. They don't just interpret the departure. They rewrite the journey. Now let's connect this directly to the rumor ecosystem. The whispers that existed during Suits were vague, unformed, peripheral. After the exit, they became central. Because now they had a purpose. They explained why she left. They explained how she succeeded. They explained why people felt uncomfortable. The rumors weren't new. They were upgraded. Upgraded from background noise to narrative glue. And once they served a narrative function, they became harder to dislodge. People didn't repeat them because they were true. They repeated them because they made the story feel complete. Here's a hard truth most people resist. Audiences don't want open-ended stories. They want arcs. They want causes and effects. They want moral clarity. Reality rarely provides that, so people manufacture it. Now consider how this exit aligned with timing. Suits was popular, but it wasn't the center of pop culture. Meghan Markle wasn't a global figure yet. The spotlight was still manageable, but the exit coincided with something else. Escalation. Suddenly, she wasn't just a former cast member. She was a figure people talked about constantly. And with that escalation came scrutiny. Scrutiny doesn't start fresh. It reaches backward. It asks, what did we miss? And when people ask that question, they often find what they're looking for, whether it exists or not. Now here's where the narrative takes a sharper turn. The exit from Suits wasn't just framed as professional. It was reframed as revealing. People said, now it makes sense. They said, this explains her behavior. They said, the signs were always there. But signs only appear once you decide to look for them. That's the trick of retrospective storytelling. Everything becomes symbolic once the ending is known. A pause in an interview becomes discomfort. A smile becomes calculation. A career move becomes evidence. This is an investigation. It's pattern seeking fueled by emotion. And emotion is a powerful editor. It cuts out inconvenient facts. It amplifies suggestive details. It fills gaps with certainty. Now let's address another uncomfortable layer. When someone leaves a show and later becomes controversial in unrelated ways, people assume continuity. They assume the later controversy must have roots in earlier behavior. So they go hunting for origin stories. Suits became an origin story people could manipulate because it was familiar, because it was accessible, because it involved a workplace people felt entitled to analyze. That entitlement is rarely acknowledged, but it drives everything. People felt allowed to dissect her time on Suits because they watched it. They felt they knew her. And familiarity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds accusation. Here's another contradiction worth naming. Many people who criticize Meghan Markle for leaving Suits celebrate actors who leave shows to pursue bigger opportunities. But celebration depends on likability. And likability is subjective. When likability drops, the same action gets reframed as selfishness. Same behavior. Different judgment. Now think about the mechanics of exit narratives. They are sticky. Once someone leaves, they can't easily counter the story without reigniting it. Responding gives rumors oxygen. Silence lets them grow. It's a trap. And once trapped, the narrative hardens. People stop asking, what happened? They start saying, we know what happened. That shift is subtle, but irreversible. And that's exactly what occurred here. The exit from Suits became the pivot point that allowed rumors to graduate into certainty. Not because new evidence emerged, but because the story needed closure. And rumor provided it. But here's where everything escalates. Because leaving a cable TV show is one thing. Entering a global spotlight is another. And when those two events collide, the narrative pressure multiplies. Old stories get recycled. Old whispers get amplified. Old assumptions get treated as prophecy. And the Suits-era rumors suddenly felt prophetic to people who wanted them to be. Because if they were true, everything else made sense. But that sense is constructed, not discovered. And once construction replaces discovery, the story becomes immune to contradiction. That's the danger of exit narratives. They don't just explain the present. They rewrite the past to justify it. And in the next chapter, we're going to look at the moment when all of this left the world of television behind. The moment when a former supporting actress became a global symbol. Because once that happened, the rumor machine didn't just hum. It roared. And nothing from the Suits era would ever be seen the same way again. What happens when a familiar face suddenly becomes unavoidable? Because there's a moment, often overlooked, when a person crosses an invisible line. A line between being known and being watched. Between being discussed and being dissected. That's the moment when everything changes. And for Meghan Markle, that moment didn't just elevate her profile. It detonated it. Let's be clear about something people often compress into a single sentence. This wasn't a gradual climb. It wasn't a gentle transition. It wasn't a quiet evolution. It was a rupture. One minute, she was a former cast member from a popular cable show. The next, she was a global figure whose every move generated headlines, think pieces, and reaction videos across continents. And when that kind of attention arrives, it doesn't come alone. It brings scrutiny. It brings resentment. It brings retroactive judgment. Here's the psychological shift that most people don't notice happening. When someone is moderately famous, audiences observe them. When someone becomes globally famous, audiences interrogate them. Observation asks, what are they doing? Interrogation asks, who are they really? That second question is where the trouble begins. Because who are they really? Invites speculation. It invites narrative building. It invites people to search backward for clues that support the story they're now emotionally invested in. And Suits, once just a TV show, became a quarry. People didn't just rewatch it for enjoyment. They rewatched it for evidence. Think about how strange that is. A scripted drama suddenly treated like surveillance footage. Scenes paused. Expressions analyzed. Moments recaptioned. Everything that once existed inside a fictional context was dragged into a real-world moral trial. But here's the contradiction. The same people who insist fiction should not be confused with reality were now doing exactly that, because it served a new narrative. And the new narrative was simple. If she is controversial now, she must have been controversial then. That assumption feels intuitive. It's also deeply flawed. Let's talk about amplification. Because this is the engine behind everything that followed. Global attention doesn't just make stories louder. It reshapes them. Stories that once required nuance get flattened. Details get stripped away. Complexity gets reduced to slogans. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the way Suits-era rumors were repackaged. Old blog posts resurfaced. Anonymous forum threads were recirculated. Half-remembered claims were presented as long-established truths. All under the banner of people are saying. Who are these people? Rarely specified. But specificity doesn't matter when the audience is primed. And by this point, the audience was primed. Because global fame doesn't arrive in a vacuum. It arrives with polarization. People don't just have opinions. They choose sides. And once sides are chosen, information stops being evaluated. It gets sorted. Does this make my side look right? If yes, keep it. If no, discard it. That's not cynicism. That's human behavior under emotional investment. Now consider how this affected the Suits narrative. Before the global spotlight, rumors were optional. After it, they became ammunition. Content creators didn't ask, is this accurate? They asked, will this perform? And performance rewards certainty. Allegedly becomes basically. Speculation becomes everyone knows. Unverified becomes widely reported. Language shifts quietly, but decisively. And with each shift, the distance from the original source grows. Here's where irony enters the picture. The louder the story became, the less grounded it was. People were arguing fiercely about events they couldn't timeline, couldn't source, and couldn't corroborate. But they felt confident. Confidence doesn't come from evidence here. It comes from volume. When enough people repeat something, it starts to feel undeniable, even when no new information has been added. This is how myths solidify in the digital age. Not through proof, through persistence. And once a myth attaches itself to a globally visible figure, it becomes self-reinforcing. Media outlets reference public sentiment. Public sentiment references media coverage. And both point back to each other as validation. A closed loop. Now let's talk about something people rarely acknowledge. Global fame changes how silence is interpreted. When a moderately famous person stays quiet, it's seen as normal. When a globally famous person stays quiet, it's seen as strategic. Silence becomes suspicious. Every non-response is framed as avoidance. Every refusal to engage becomes evidence of something to hide. But engaging carries its own risks. Responding dignifies the claim. Denying amplifies it. Correcting invites escalation. So silence becomes the least damaging option, even though it's rarely interpreted that way. This trap is invisible to most observers. They say, if it weren't true, she'd say something. But what they don't see is the cost-benefit analysis behind that silence. And when the cost of speaking is higher than the cost of rumor, silence wins. Unfortunately, silence also feeds speculation. Which brings us to another uncomfortable truth. The Suits-era rumors gained their power not because Meghan Markle confirmed or denied them, but because she became too big to ignore. Her visibility made every past narrative feel relevant. People didn't just want to know who she was now. They wanted an origin story. And origin stories are rarely fair. They're designed to explain outcomes people feel conflicted about. Here's the contradiction at the heart of it. Many who criticized her rise claimed they were skeptical of celebrity culture, yet they engaged in it relentlessly. They analyzed, theorized, and consumed content about someone they claimed to distrust. Why? Because outrage is compelling. Outrage creates engagement. Engagement creates community. Community reinforces belief. And belief doesn't require verification. It requires belonging. Now think about this. When a person becomes a symbol, they stop being treated like an individual. They become a canvas. People project frustrations on.